everyone. Sabbath greetings to those who are joining us on the internet. To Denise and Henderson Andrews in Grenada, welcome. Brethren, as we heard in the prayer, today is a holy day. It's a special day, and it's also what we would call a double Sabbath. It's the weekly Sabbath as well as it's an annual Sabbath. Because as we all know, today is the first day of unleavened bread. And it's the first holy day in God's annual holy days or festivals. Now there is great meaning and significance attached to it. Physically, it requires us to put leaven out of our homes and our lives for 7 days. And to not eat leavened products during those 7 days. So that's the first aspect. Secondly, it requires us to eat unleavened bread for these 7 days. Now those are the physical aspects of it. Spiritually, the days of unleavened bread picture us putting sin out of our lives and at the same time putting in the righteousness of God. So brethren, today in the sermonette, I want to focus on one aspect of sin that we need to put out of our lives and one aspect of righteousness that we need to put in. Now, we generally obtain a lot of our information about how to observe the Passover and the days of unleavened bread from the letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. For example, on the Passover evening that we celebrated a few days ago, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is usually quoted. And it describes the right attitude we need to have in order to take the Passover. And for the days of unleavened bread, however, we tend to refer to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul encourages the Corinthian brethren to keep the feast of unleavened bread with sincerity and truth. And that is in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 8. But today I want to look at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul identifies a particular problem that the Corinthian brethren had. So if we would all turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and let's begin in verse 1. 1 Corinthians 5 verse 1. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality as is not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. And you are puffed up, and have not rather mourned, that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. Now, in verse 2 here, Paul identifies the source of the problems that the Corinthians faced. They were puffed up. In other words, they were filled with pride. And he does not only tell them that once, he says it a few times. And if we would go back a few verses in chapter 4, and let's look at verse 18. Verse 18 of chapter 4, where Paul says, "Now some are puffed up, as though I were not coming to you. But I will come to you shortly, if the Lord wills, and I will know not the word of those who are puffed up, but the power. So brethren, in these verses we see that Paul was trying to get the Corinthian brethren to recognize that the source of the problems that they were experiencing as a church was pride. And brethren, the same principle applies to us as a church today. If we have problems amongst ourselves, it can usually be traced back to pride. And in fact, pride is the major source of many sins. If we were to look, for example, at Satan, what we see is that he was filled with pride. He wanted to be number one. And this eventually led to him rebelling against God. Pride was the beginning of Satan's downfall. And what we see also is that pride was also the beginning of man's downfall. And if we look back at the Garden of Eden, at the first human sin, what we see is that Eve wanted to become like God, to know both good and evil. And let's just take a look at that. Let's go to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, and let's look at verse 5. Genesis 3 verse 5. This is where Satan is talking to Eve. For God knows, in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. Brethren, notice the words, a tree desirable to make one wise. Satan appealed to Eve's desire to become wise, to gain knowledge and understanding, which are some of the prerequisites to becoming wise. Now, on the surface, this may seem harmless. What could be wrong with gaining knowledge, with knowing what is good and evil? But, brethren, there is a hidden danger associated with gaining knowledge. And Paul identifies that hidden danger. And let's go back to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And let's begin in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 8. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up. Brethren, notice those words. Knowledge puffs up. The more knowledge we acquire, the more we tend to become puffed up. And if we are not careful, our level of pride tends to increase. Now, the question can be asked, how can we prevent this from happening? What is the solution? Well, Paul gives the answer in the next few words. So let's continue in verse 1. But love edifies. Brethren, love edifies or builds up. And as the saying goes, love is the answer. Love is the goal. It is the destination that we are all required to achieve. But before we can be filled with love, there are many attitudes that we first need to incorporate in our lives. And Brethren, one of the main ones is humility. Humility is the antidote to pride. And one of the best ways to remove pride is to replace it with an attitude of humility. And this is probably the reason why Jesus lists humility as the first beatitude that we all need to develop as Christians. Because he said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Brethren, humility is one of the foundational attitudes that we must develop in order to be eventually filled with love. And the more we humble ourselves, the less pride we will have. Now, our Savior, Jesus Christ, set the example for us when it comes to the attitude of humility. And let's look at Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 8. Verse 8 of Philippians 2. "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross." Brethren, Jesus humbled himself in order to come to earth to die for us. And this is the greatest act of humility that can be achieved. God becoming man in order to die. Jesus requires us to humble ourselves if we are to eventually develop the mind of Christ. Now, James also encourages us to humble ourselves. And let's look at James chapter 4, our final scripture, James chapter 4, and let's look at verse 10. Verse 10. "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up." Brethren, if we humble ourselves now, God will eventually lift us up in the first resurrection, and we will rise to meet Christ in the clouds when he returns. So in conclusion, brethren, as we celebrate these days of unleavened bread, let us strive with increased zeal and enthusiasm to put sin and pride out of our lives and put humility and righteousness into our lives. Well, brethren, as this is one of those times of the year when we take up an offering, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 16, where we look at that instruction to take up an offering. Deuteronomy chapter 16, and let's begin in verse 16. "3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God which he has given you." So brethren, we will now be taking up an offering, and while that is being done,